The room went quiet just as the final bid landed, the sound sharp as glass against marble, and I felt my hands go cold around the tray I was holding. The painting hung under warm lights, colors breathing softly, and I knew it the way you know a scar on your own body. My heart was racing, but my face stayed still, because no one was looking at me anyway. If you've ever trusted the wrong person, if you've ever been quietly erased while standing in plain sight, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Stories like this happen more often than people admit. I stood there in my black catering uniform while applause rose for someone else's name, and a private detail only I could recognize confirmed what I was seeing. That was my work, my past, my life, rewritten without my consent. I didn't know it yet, but that was the exact moment everything I believed about family, patience, and silence began to fall apart. I was carrying a tray of champagne glasses through a Soho gallery when the room went silent. A voice announced the final bid, the kind of number that makes people straighten their backs, and then applause broke out like rain on marble. I wasn't supposed to be watching. I was hired help, an older woman in black, invisible by design. But I looked up anyway. The painting on the wall pulled the air out of my lungs. I knew it the way you know your own handwriting, the crooked horizon, the faint thumbprint buried in the lower corner where I'd smeared paint, wiping my hands years ago. No one else could see that. I could. My knees locked. They praised the artist's vision, her bold return to form. They said her name clearly, proudly, my daughter-in-law's name. I stood there holding strangers' drinks while people celebrated something that had once lived in my small apartment, leaning against a cracked radiator, drying overnight while I slept on the couch. I felt heat crawl up my neck. Not loud anger, not yet. Something sharper, quieter. A realization settling in. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. And in that moment, as the applause faded and the auction moved on, I understood that the life I thought I was living had already been rewritten without my consent. Right then, everything I trusted fractured. I don't look like the kind of woman whose work sells under bright lights. These days, I live in a rent-controlled apartment in Queens, the kind with uneven floors and a view of brick. I wake up early because my body does that now. Even when I don't have a shift, money is always a calculation. Groceries, bus fare, heat in the winter. I am careful, quiet, and mostly unseen. That wasn't always me. There was a time when my hands were always stained with paint, when I believed talent was enough if you worked hard and stayed honest. In my 20s and 30s, I showed pieces in small galleries, juried shows, community spaces that smelled like sawdust and coffee. I wasn't famous, but I was hopeful. I thought my life would expand. Then life narrowed instead. Marriage, caregiving, responsibility. When my husband got sick, art became something I packed away so I could be practical. After he died, survival took precedence over dreams. I told myself it was temporary. Years passed anyway. People stopped asking what I did. They started telling me who I was. I became someone reliable, someone who helped with grandchildren, cooked meals, filled gaps, someone whose paintings were described as a phase, a talent that never quite went anywhere. I absorbed that quietly, even when it hurt. Still, I never threw my brushes out. I never stopped seeing the world in color and shadow. Standing in that gallery, I realized the distance between who I was and who I became wasn't failure. It was cost. And it was paid inside a family that had been watching me fade. They saw my silence as permission, my patience as surrender. And long before the auction, decisions about my work were already being made without me ever knowing. I love my son deeply, but loving him also meant learning how small I was expected to be around his life. He and his wife visited when schedules allowed, usually briefly. carrying an air of being busy, important, slightly distracted. Their politeness was smooth, practiced, and distant, like a door left half closed. They spoke about my life with gentle concern that always landed as judgment, questions about money, about why I still worked shifts, about whether it was time to slow down. My art came up rarely, and when it did, it felt like a childhood hobby politely humored. I nodded, smiled, and adjusted myself accordingly. My daughter-in-law moved through the world with confidence. She took up space easily, spoke about her ambitions without apology, and assumed her ideas deserved attention. I admired that once. Over time, I learned that her certainty made my quiet feel inconvenient. My son followed her lead, not unkindly, just unquestioningly. I started shrinking without realizing it. I stopped mentioning exhibitions I dreamed about, stopped leaving canvases out when they visited. I learned that harmony came from being agreeable, from not complicating things. Silence became a skill. None of this felt dramatic in the moment. It was ordinary, routine, almost reasonable. That's what made it powerful. By the time I accepted a catering job at a gallery, wearing black and blending into walls, it didn't feel strange. It felt familiar. I had already practiced disappearing inside my own family, and I had learned how to stand quietly while other people decided what my work and my presence were worth. That habit followed me everywhere, shaping choices, expectations, and the silence I carried forward always. I took the catering job because I needed steady hours. That was the honest reason. Rent doesn't pause for grief or pride, and I was past the age of pretending money would somehow work itself out. When my daughter-in-law mentioned a gallery that needed reliable staff, I said yes before I thought too hard about what that meant. Walking into those Manhattan spaces again felt like stepping into a life I had folded away. White walls, polished concrete, the low echo of footsteps, the smell of paint and wine mixed together, familiar and distant at the same time. I moved through the rooms with trays and towels, careful not to touch anything, careful not to look too long. Art surrounded me, but I wasn't part of it anymore. I wasn't there to explain choices or talk about process. I was there to refill glasses and disappear. Still, something in my chest stirred. Being close to work again, even like that, woke up parts of me I thought had gone quiet for good. What unsettled me was how natural it all felt to everyone else. My daughter-in-law spoke about the gallery casually, confidently, as if my presence there was an obvious fit. She never mentioned my history with art, and I didn't offer it. I told myself it was coincidence. Nothing more. I kept my head down and did my job. I needed the income, and I didn't trust the feeling creeping in, the sense that this arrangement balanced on something fragile. I chose not to examine it too closely, yet I was moving between rooms when I saw it hanging alone under a soft light. At first my mind resisted. Paintings resemble each other all the time. I told myself that. Still, my body stopped before my thoughts did. The brushwork pulled me closer. The uneven sky I never fixed. The way the blue thinned near the edge because I'd run out of pigment and refused to remix it. These were decisions made in a quiet apartment years ago, not trends. I felt a hollow pressure behind my ribs. I remembered the basement flood clearly. The smell of damp cardboard, water climbing the legs of shelves. I had stacked my canvases too low, thinking I would move them later. When the water receded, the frames warped and the paint blistered. I mourned that piece in particular. I believed it was gone forever. Standing there, I looked for the corner where I always signed my work small, almost apologetically. The spot was still there, but the name wasn't. Another signature sat on top of mine, heavier, confident. deliberately placed. My name had been buried, not erased. That was the moment doubt left me. This painting hadn't survived by chance. It had been recovered, cleaned, and claimed. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. As I stood in uniform beneath it, listening to footsteps and polite laughter, anger settled quietly beside the shock. I understood then that I wasn't witnessing a coincidence. I was standing inside a theft. Nothing in that room prepared me for how quickly certainty can harden. Grief shifted shape. It sharpened. I kept my face neutral, my hands steady, learning in real time how to hold rage without letting it spill. Above me, the painting waited, silent and unchanged, while I recalibrated who I was inside myself. I kept working. That was the strangest part. My body knew the routine better than my heart knew what to do. I poured wine, cleared glasses, nodded when people thanked me, all while my chest felt too tight for air. The bidding continued. Numbers climbed effortlessly, spoken like they meant nothing. Applause rose and fell. People smiled at each other with the easy confidence of those who expect to be seen. I moved between them unnoticed, carrying the weight of what I knew alone. Every sound felt louder. The hum of conversation pressed against my ears. I focused on my hands so they wouldn't shake. If I let myself look at the painting again, I was afraid something would break open in me that I couldn't close. At one point, I felt eyes on me. I looked up and met my daughter-in-law's gaze across the room. It lasted only a second. Her expression didn't change. There was no surprise there, no fear, just certainty. That was when it landed fully. She never expected me to understand. She had counted on my silence, on my age, on the version of me that stayed small and grateful, standing there, invisible and uniformed. I realized how thoroughly she thought she had erased me. I finished the shift without a word. Inside, something hardened. Shock cooled into clarity. I wasn't confused anymore. I was alert, controlled, awake. Whatever this was, it had been planned. I didn't sleep after the auction. I sat at my kitchen table long after midnight, replaying details I had ignored for years. Once the shock faded, memory sharpened. The basement flood came back first, the rain that wouldn't stop, the rush to save what I could. I remembered how quickly help arrived after my daughter-in-law offered to arrange cleanup, how relieved I felt handing responsibility over. At the time, it seemed generous. That night, I pictured the shelves again, which boxes were soaked, which weren't. I remembered a canvas that wasn't waterlogged enough to be thrown away, only marked for restoration. I remembered thinking it had disappeared during the chaos. I reached out to the contractor the next morning, steady and polite. I asked myself to listen, not accuse. He confirmed what my body already knew. Someone else had removed several pieces for off-site drying and storage. Someone whose last name matched my son's household. Permission had been given. Instructions were clear. The timeline settled into place with an awful calm. The cleaning, the storage, the quiet years that followed, the sudden reappearance of my work under a new name. None of it required luck. It required access and confidence. I sat there as the facts aligned, feeling something colder than grief. This wasn't a misunderstanding or poor communication. It was a plan built on the assumption that I wouldn't ask questions, wouldn't notice, wouldn't be believed. What hurt most wasn't the cleverness of it. It was how well it fit the version of me they thought I was. By the time dawnlight reached my window, confusion was gone. I understood exactly what had been taken from me and how deliberately it had been done. I didn't rush forward. I planned to move slowly, quietly, and with proof, letting patience become my leverage instead of fear. That decision marked the moment anger finally learned discipline inside me for good. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't cry into the phone or demand explanations. I did something quieter. I stopped being polite. For years, politeness had been my shield. It kept peace. It kept me included. It also kept me ignored. Sitting alone with the truth laid out in front of me, I understood that silence had never protected me. It had simply made me convenient. Anger was there, steady and hot, but I didn't let it drive. I let it sharpen me. I went through old folders and envelopes I hadn't opened in years, exhibition postcards, photographs of my work hanging in borrowed spaces, dated sketches, notes I'd written to myself about color choices and revisions, proof of process, proof of authorship. I organized everything carefully, the way I used to prepare canvases before painting. Nothing rushed, nothing emotional. Each piece placed where it belonged. I could feel myself returning, not to who I was before, but to someone more precise. I stopped rehearsing apologies in my head. I stopped wondering how to make this easier for anyone else. What had been taken from me deserved clarity, not courtesy. I owed myself that much. By the end of that week, I knew what my next step would be. I wasn't going to accuse or explode. I was going to verify, document, and be believed. For the first time in years, I wasn't asking for space. I was claiming it. That decision steadied my hands, straightened my spine, and reminded me that patience could be power when used deliberately at last. I didn't want reassurance. I wanted confirmation. Still, making the appointment felt heavier than I expected. I carried my folder across the city like it could fall apart in my hands. Part of me was braced to be dismissed, to be told memory isn't evidence and age distorts certainty. The specialist listened. That alone steadied me. I watched him examine photographs, brushstroke enlargements, pigment samples from my old records. He explained the process calmly, how layering, pressure, and material choices leave signatures as distinct as fingerprints. I followed every word, afraid to interrupt the flow of being taken seriously. When he pointed out consistencies only the original artist would produce, relief loosened something tight in my chest. When he showed where the visible signature didn't match the underlying work, relief gave way to something colder. This wasn't reinterpretation or homage. It was alteration, intentional, careful, designed to pass. I felt strangely calm as he spoke. Validation didn't come as a rush of triumph. It came as quiet grounding. I hadn't imagined this. I hadn't misunderstood. What I knew in my bones had a professional name now. Then he paused and asked about the rest of my work, where it had been stored, what else I had lost in the flood. He explained that patterns like this rarely involve a single piece. Access tends to be exploited thoroughly. I heard myself answering, cataloging memories I had never needed to list before. Walking home, the city felt sharper, louder. This was no longer just about one painting or one betrayal. The scope was widening, and with it, the responsibility. What had been taken from me might not end with me. That realization followed me all the way back to my apartment, settling in quietly, preparing me for what came next. I thought I was chasing one truth, one stolen thing. That illusion didn't last. As professionals looked closer, patterns emerged that had nothing to do with me personally. Similar provenance gaps, similar restorations done quietly, similar stories from artists who had stepped back from the spotlight because life demanded it. Older artists, caregivers, widows, people who trusted family or institutions to handle what they could no longer manage alone. I recognized myself in every description. We were careful, grateful, unassuming, easy to overlook and easy to take from. That realization landed heavier than the original betrayal. What happened to me wasn't unique. It was efficient. I learned that pieces had surfaced under different names, sold through different channels, always clean on paper, always slightly altered, enough to pass, enough to silence doubt. The scale of it was sobering. This wasn't opportunism. It was a system that rewarded confidence and punished quietness. For a moment, fear crept back in. It's one thing to confront a family member. It's another to stand against a structure designed to protect itself. I understood what exposure costs. I had already lived a life shaped by compromise. But I also understood something else. If I stepped back now, the pattern would continue. Silence would become endorsement. My loss would become a template. I didn't feel brave. I felt obligated. What began as a personal reckoning had widened into something communal. I couldn't unknow what I knew, so I agreed to move forward, not loudly, not recklessly, but visibly. Whatever happened next would no longer happen in the dark, and that truth changed everything. I was prepared. The first time I felt it shifting was in a room much quieter than the auction. A conference table, neutral walls, people who asked careful questions and took careful notes, no raised voices, no accusations spoken out loud, just pauses where there hadn't been pauses before. Then it moved outward. Names that once carried weight started being said more cautiously. Invitations slowed, meetings were postponed. I watched from the edges as confidence thinned and certainty cracked. The same people who had once filled rooms now avoided eye contact, their conversations shorter, their laughter tighter. I didn't need to say anything. The truth was doing the work on its own. Provenance was questioned. Records were reviewed. Stories that had sounded polished began to fray when examined too closely. Authority shifted in subtle ways, the kind you only notice if you're used to being dismissed. Seeing my daughter-in-law in those spaces again was disorienting. She still stood straight, still spoke smoothly, but something essential was gone. The ease, the assumption that control was permanent. I felt no urge to confront her. Watching was enough. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt. There was relief, yes, and a sober sense of balance returning, but no triumph. Public unraveling is not cinematic. It's slow. It's uncomfortable. It's full of silences where certainty used to live. I stayed observant, grounded. I reminded myself that this wasn't about winning. It was about truth-finding air. As the process continued, I understood that nothing could be undone. Reputations don't snap back into place once questioned. Relationships don't return to their original shape. Whatever came next would take time, and it would cost something from everyone involved. The reckoning had started, and it wasn't finished yet. When things finally slowed, I expected to feel victorious. That's what stories promise. Closure, satisfaction, a clean sense of right and wrong restored. Instead, there was a quiet drop, like the air leaving a room after a long storm. I woke up tired in a deeper way than before. Not angry tired, finished tired. Justice didn't arrive with applause or relief sharp enough to cut through everything else. It arrived softly, carrying weight. I felt steadier, but also sadder, as if something delicate had finally been set down and could not be picked back up. I gained truth. That mattered. I gained my name back, my work acknowledged for what it was and who made it. That mattered too. But I also lost something I hadn't named until then, the illusion that doing the right thing would spare me grief. It didn't. It just changed the shape of it. There were scars justice didn't touch, Years of being dismissed, relationships that could not be repaired once exposed to light. A family structure that had depended on my silence and now had to reckon with its absence. Nothing snapped back into place. It all shifted. What surprised me most was the calm that followed. Not happiness, not bitterness, clarity. I understood that justice is not revenge dressed up nicely. It's truth brought into the open, even when it costs you comfort. I didn't feel finished. I felt altered. Justice wasn't the end of the story. It was a threshold I had crossed, leaving one version of myself behind without fully knowing who I would become next. What surprised me most was how ordinary the rebuilding felt. There was no dramatic turning point where everything suddenly made sense. It was smaller than that. Quieter. I started making decisions without explaining them first. I stopped checking whether my choices made anyone else uncomfortable. I rearranged my apartment so light reached the table where I paint, not to prove anything, just because I wanted to. I bought better brushes with my own money and didn't feel guilty about it. I painted when I felt like it, stopped when I didn't, and let the work be unfinished without apologizing to myself. Art stopped being evidence. It became expression again. Some days that meant color and movement. Other days it meant sitting with a blank canvas and trusting that silence was part of the process. I didn't rush myself back into visibility. I chose when and how I wanted to be seen. Outside the studio, I noticed changes too. I spoke more plainly. I said no without adding explanations. I listened to my instincts instead of overriding them for the sake of peace. These weren't grand gestures, but they added up. They felt like ownership. I realized that what had been taken from me wasn't just work. It was agency. Reclaiming that didn't require recognition or validation from anyone else. It required consistency, honesty, self-respect practiced daily. I wasn't trying to recover an old version of myself. That woman belonged to a different life. I was becoming someone steadier, clearer, less willing to disappear. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something happening to me. It felt like something I was actively shaping, one deliberate choice at a time. For a long time, I thought this story was about art, about ownership, about something tangible being taken and returned. It took everything that happened for me to understand it was never really about the painting. It was about visibility, about how easily a person can be rewritten when they stay quiet long enough. I learned how silence can be mistaken for consent, how politeness can be used as a tool against you, and how slowly you can disappear without ever leaving the room. What changed me wasn't exposure or accountability. It was the moment I decided I mattered enough to listen to myself, to trust what I knew, to stop shrinking so other people could stay comfortable. That choice didn't make me louder. It made me clearer. I don't regret the years I spent being careful. They shaped my patience, my empathy, my ability to see beneath surfaces, but I no longer confuse endurance with worth. I no longer believe that taking up space requires permission. If there's one thing I carry forward, it's this. Reclaiming your voice doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's choosing yourself in ways no one else applauds. And sometimes it starts much later in life than you ever expected. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. Truly. Sharing it wasn't easy, but it felt necessary. And if any part of it sounded familiar, if you've ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or erased in ways that took years to notice, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever had to reclaim something that should have been yours all along? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.